The River Thames flows for 215 miles from the Cotswolds to the Thames Estuary, and it's one of England's flagship sites. The name Thames comes from the Old English word Temisis, meaning dark one, and this river's history is every bit as dark as that of the land it runs through. They say that on average one body a week is pulled from the River Thames. Some are found relatively easily, while others are found much later and in varying states. Some, I'm sure, are never found again. This could have easily been the case in this story if it wasn't for a chance discovery on the Thames embankment at Waterloo Bridge in 1866. On Tuesday, January 16th, some men working within a caisson, which is a submerged airtight chamber, during the extension of the embankment next to Somerset House in Strand, found a human skeleton several feet beneath the river bed. The skeleton, which was complete apart from the bones on the hands and feet, was handed over to a police officer named Bell, who then passed them over to Coroner J.W. Payne Esquire. An inquest was held at a pub on Essex Street called the Essex Head, which is now the Edgar Wallace. On the opening day, which was Thursday, January 18th, Coroner J.W. Payne laid the skeleton out on a table next to the items found with it. They consisted of a set of false teeth set in gold, a small knife, a pair of tortoiseshell glasses, and a silver pencil case marked with the maker's name, the patent number, and the date of registration. It read, John Sheldon, 1184, April 8, 1842. The clothing was almost completely destroyed apart from a single boot of military fashion, an upper section of a coat, and part of a trouser leg. There were 2 halfpennies in the pocket of what remained of the coat, but unsurprisingly no identity papers were found. One of the most interesting things presented at the inquest was a key marked with the maker's name and address. It read, Chubb, St Paul's Churchyard, number 29. Locksmith John Chubb, whose father Charles Chubb founded the now well-known company, said that all keys were numbered, and that particular key, number 29, was one of 30 keys which had been issued to a government office in 1839. According to the coroner and a surgeon named John Walsh, the bones had been in the water for between 15 and 20 years. They belonged to a male, approximately 5'6", who was between 50 and 60 years old. The skull was intact, which goes against many newspaper reports at the time which stated it was fractured. John Walsh said that there were no clear signs of violence to any of the remaining bones. The pierman at Waterloo Bridge was Mr. William Watts. Watts, alongside Inspector Dell of the Thames Police, had dredged and inspected the surrounding area where the skeleton was found. In their opinion, the person had become, quote, sandbound some years ago. Judging by the military style of the boots, the gold-set false teeth, the silver pencil case and the high quality of the coat and trousers, which were examined by a tailor, it was assumed that the person had been in a superior position in life and was likely a military man. The inquest was adjourned awaiting an appeal to the government military offices and the results of the inquiry into the key. The inquest continued on Thursday, January 25th. The coroner had been in contact with the Secretary of State for War, George Robinson, for whom the key had been made, but after a search of all records no information was found. A person from Whitechapel came forward to say that their 23-year-old brother, who had been a heavy gambler, went missing some years ago, and that they'd always suspected he'd been murdered after a successful night. A journalist for the Cheltenham Examiner newspaper tactlessly wrote that it was more likely that his brother had committed suicide after an unsuccessful night. As the age of the man didn't match the coroner's estimated age of 50 to 60, little credence was given to either theory. The false teeth were traced to a manufacturer on Broad Street, now known as Broadwick Street, close to Golden Square, but as they had only made the teeth, they had no idea which dentist had set them. The inquest was adjourned again pending more inquiries. February 9, 1866 was the final day of the inquest, and it was predominantly taken up by the evidence given by one Harriet Elizabeth Clopham, who resided at 160 Goswell Street, which is now Goswell Road, in Clerkenwell. She had come forward to say that her husband, who had been a wealthy architect, went missing in 1851. They had only been married 13 months, and at the time of his disappearance their child was only 2 weeks old. The woman, who was clearly emotional, explained that he had last been seen close to Blackfriars Bridge, which is less than a mile east of Waterloo Bridge. When presented with the various items that had been found with the remains, Mrs. Clopham was vague in her recollection. She thought she recognised the pencil case as her husband's, but could not be sure. Her husband did carry a knife, but she didn't think it was the one presented to her. Her recollection of the glasses was equally vague. When asked about the false teeth, she said she didn't know if her husband had false teeth or not. Coroner J.W. Payne said that surely she would know this, but Clopham explained that she rarely saw her husband, and bizarrely, that he used to keep his mouth closed in a peculiar way. She added that he had a very high, large nose. The coroner confirmed that judging by the nasal cavity on the skull, this must have been true in the case of the deceased. However, in summing up, the coroner said that Mrs. Clopham had not clearly identified any of the belongings, adding that she had no knowledge of the false teeth. The matter of the teeth was brought before the Dentological Society, and although every effort had been made to find out who the teeth were issued to, nothing was found. After some discussion, the jury stated that there was no way of knowing how the body ended up at the embankment near Somerset House, and no way to determine the cause of death. They returned an open verdict. Capital punishment has a long and grim history in Britain. The means of punishment have taken many horrific forms, but hanging was, for centuries, the preferred method. During the 18th and 19th centuries, hangings for murder, treason and other serious crimes was most commonly carried out at either the gallows at Tyburn or Newgate Prison. But for offences like piracy, mutiny and other crimes committed at sea, a fate even worse than the Tyburn or Newgate gallows faced prisoners on the Thames foreshore at Wapping. This map from 1746 shows the location of the execution stairs, which leads to the Wapping foreshore where pirate hangings took place, and this is the same location today. But the exact location of the gallows is disputed. Some historians believe it was located at what is now the Execution Dockhouse, because the site is marked with a large E. Other possible locations are the Captain Kidd pub, named after a pirate who was executed here, the town of Ramsgate pub, or the Prospect of Whitby pub, located less than half a mile downstream, where a replica of the gallows stands. What is known for certain is that this small stretch of the Thames shore saw the death of numerous sailors and pirates, hanged for their seafaring crimes as far back as the 15th century. The prisoners once found guilty were most commonly held at Marshalsea Prison in Southwark. On the day of the execution they were taken from their cell and paraded along London Bridge, past the Tower of London and through the streets of Wapping. The procession itself was led by the Admiralty Marshal or one of his deputies. Along this route, on the Wapping High Street, was a pub called the Turk's Head. This was the designated place for a prisoner to be served his last quart of ale before the procession continued. The original Wapping Street Turk's Head no longer stands and is often confused with the present-day Turk's Head, which itself dates back to the 19th century and can be found on the corner of Green Bank and Trent Street. Executions were a popular social event. The streets were often lined with spectators and the river was busy with crowded boats. The gallows, which were constructed on the Thames shore, had a much shorter rope than usual. This was to make sure that when hanged, the prisoner's neck would not break. Instead, they would suffer a much slower death by asphyxiation. During the final throes of death, the prisoner would often spasm grotesquely. This became known as the Marshal's Dance. The dead prisoner would then be cut down, chained to the bank of the Thames, and left there until they had been submerged by 3 tides of the river. One of the best known cases is that of the infamous Scottish pirate Captain William Kidd, who pirated for Richard Coote, the governor of New York, Massachusetts and New Hampshire. In 1698, William Kidd took control of the Kedar merchant ship. The ship had a crew of Armenian sailors, but what Kidd did not realise is that the ship's captain was British, and part of the cargo was destined for England. For this takeover and the earlier murder of one of his crewmen who had turned against him, William Kidd became a wanted man in England. Richard Coote, the man Kidd had worked for, fearing for his own life, handed him over to the British authorities. William Kidd was imprisoned at Boston Jail for a year before being returned to England to face his punishment. He was hanged at the execution dock on May 23, 1701, but the rope snapped. Many onlookers believed that this was a sign from God that he should not be executed, but he was retrieved and hanged again, this time successfully. In a ritual that only applied to the most infamous criminals, Kidd was taken to Tilbury in Essex and gibbeted, or hung in chains, on the Thames shore. His slowly deteriorating corpse was left there to hang for years as a warning to other seafaring criminals. The execution dock, which was used less frequently as the decades passed, saw its final hangings in 1830. The story behind what led to the execution of William Watts and George Davies is an intriguing one. The ship known as the Cyprus was built in 1816 and first launched in Sunderland, England. 10 years later it was purchased for the purpose of transporting prisoners to Tasmania, which was then known as Van Diemen's Land. In what would be her last voyage in 1829, there was a mutiny on board. While the ship was anchored at Research Bay, 19 of the 31 convicts took control of the vessel. One of them, William Swallow, was forced to take the helm because he was the only prisoner with sailing experience. They left behind 12 other convicts and the ship's crew. The Cyprus then sailed to New Zealand, where the prisoners plundered a schooner called the Samuel for the sealskins its crew had gathered. From there they sailed to Tonga, where 7 of the prisoners decided to remain, and then on to Japan. By now the prisoners, desperately low on food and water, sought help, but they were attacked by the Japanese and forced back to the high seas. This time they sailed to Canton in China, where the prisoners deliberately sunk the Cyprus and claimed that they were castaways from another ship. Eventually, William Swallow and 4 other men, including George Davies and William Watts, made their way back to England on a British-owned ship called the Charles Grant. One of the prisoners who remained in China, however, confessed to taking part in the mutiny, and by chance word got back to London before the Charles Grant arrived there a week later. When recaptured, William Swallow, George Davies, William Watts and 2 other men faced trial for their involvement in the mutiny. However, Swallow was ultimately spared the death penalty because he claimed he'd been forced to sell the ship, and with his life at stake, it was agreed that he had little choice. The 2 remaining men were also acquitted due to their good conduct since capture and the poor conditions they were subjected to during the voyage. After George Davies and William Watts were marched down to the execution dock, they turned to one another and shook hands before facing their slow and painful deaths. An account of the voyage written by William Swallow included a dramatic account of the events in Japan. For many years this was thought to be complete fiction. That is until 2017, when amateur historian Nick Russell, whilst living on the island of Shikoku, uncovered an 1830 account written by samurai Makita Hamaguchi. It described a barbarian ship flying a British flag and coming ashore at Shikoku. It states that when a number of samurai boarded and searched the vessel, they found prisoners on board who begged for their lives and offered gifts. Despite this, they were sent away due to Japan's isolation policy, which meant they were a strictly closed country. Many points of Hamaguchi's account matched those described by Swallow, and it even included a watercolour painting of the ship. Just before 1 p.m. on Sunday, July 21st, 1895, a man named Charles Routledge, who was a lieutenant of the South Staffordshire Regiment, found the body of a young woman at Marlow Lock in Buckinghamshire. She lay in 3 feet of water with one arm outstretched onto the shore. Routledge and the lock keeper Mr. Gray rowed out to retrieve her body before turning it over to the police. She was found to be heavily pregnant. There was a small glass vial in the pocket of her blue dress, and the body was badly decomposed. At the inquest held on Wednesday, July 24th at the Two Brewers pub in Marlow, John Norcott and his family, who lived at West Hill in nearby Henley-on-Thames, identified the girl as their daughter and sister, 18-year-old Agnes Norcott. The family recognised the blue dress and her silver brooch, but it was a mole on her left leg and the fact that she was pregnant that left no doubt in their minds. The family explained that she had been seeing a 25-year-old married man by the name of Frank King, who was the father of her unborn child. The couple had left Henley-on-Thames from Shiplake train station on July 4th, where they were seen off by Agnes's sister Lily, who said they were visiting Hampton Court. As Frank King was the last person to be seen with Agnes, he was suspected of killing her. A verdict of willful murder was returned, and the inquest was adjourned for 2 weeks awaiting King's arrest. Agnes was interred at Holy Trinity Church in Henley-on-Thames immediately following the inquest. On her coffin was a plaque with the inscription, Agnes Norcott, aged 18. The following day, murder suspect Frank King arrived at Henley-on-Thames police station. Accompanying him, alive and well, was Agnes Norcott. Frank and Agnes had read about the inquest and the fact that Frank was a wanted man during their return journey. They were both given summonses to attend the adjourned inquest on August 7th. As the body at Marlow Lock was now interred, the only thing that remained of the girl prior to exhumation was the dress and brooch she wore. It was these items that led to the body being correctly identified as Alice Few. The pregnant 22-year-old had left her home in Egham on July 15th to visit her fiancé George Lockyer in Guildford and had not been heard from since. According to her friends, she was in high spirits when she left, but after they had not heard from her in a few days, a letter was sent to George Lockyer's home. They received the reply that Alice had never arrived. So how did Alice, who left Egham to travel to Guildford, end up in Marlow Lock, which was 16 miles in the opposite direction? Well, seeing as Alice's sister once lived in Henley-on-Thames, but unbeknownst to Alice had recently moved away, it was surmised that she intended to pay her a visit, possibly for advice regarding her pregnancy, but had somehow ended up in the Thames at Henley and was carried downstream to Marlow. July 15th, the day of Alice's departure, is thought to be the day she died, as her body was said to have been in the water for between a week and 10 days when it was discovered on July 21st. In light of the mistaken identity, and the fact that there was still an unexplained death afoot, the inquest continued as planned. When Frank King and Agnes Norcott gave evidence, King explained that he was not married as had been reported, but he had been living with a woman who had passed for his wife. On July 4th, the day that Frank and Agnes caught the train, the woman had left him taking her 4 children, none of which were his. He confirmed that he and Alice had been having an affair, and that he was the father of her child. A woman named Maria Few, who was the mother of the deceased, then presented a photograph of her late daughter, which showed her wearing the same dress and brooch she had worn on the day she died. A shoemaker by the name of Joseph Shipway also gave evidence to say that the heels on the boots that Alice wore were repaired by him. He said that he knew that the deceased was Alice because in his 20-year career he had only made 2 repairs of that kind. The body, now exhumed, was unrecognisable, so the identification notes from the first inquest were shown, and the curious series of coincidences that led to the mistaken identity were addressed. First of all, it was agreed that the dress and brooch were almost identical to those worn by Agnes. The women were of similar height with fair complexions, both were pregnant, and they both had moles in the same place on the left leg. Aside from this, there was a graze on the cheek and a bruise behind the ear. According to coroner John Dixon, these wounds had occurred in the river after death. The tongue was partially bitten off, but Dixon said that this was most likely self-inflicted in the throes of drowning. When Alice's fiancé George Lockyer gave evidence, he said that he had received a letter from Alice on July 15th, saying that she would visit him on that day. He also said that although they were engaged to be married, they had not slept together, and he had no idea that she was 8 months pregnant. This curious statement may have been a bad attempt to save face in a conservative Victorian-era England. On the other hand, if it was true, could it have been the reason for Alice's attempt to find her sister, and after realising that she wasn't there to help her, could she have taken her own life? The subject of suicide was then raised. The glass vial found in the dress was suspected by many to have contained poison, but after it was tested prior to the burial, it was found to contain nothing more than peppermint. There were also no signs of poison in the body. With no clear signs of foul play, the final verdict given on August 7, 1895, was that Alice Few had drowned in the Thames at Marlow. As a slightly humorous postscript to an otherwise sad story, Frank King was brought before the coroner at the end of the inquest. He was chastised for his, quote, disgraceful mode of life, and was only reimbursed part of his expenses. It was Thursday, August 27, 1981, when 17-year-old Claire Woolterton went to meet John Ive at an amusement arcade on Uxbridge Road, West Ealing. Soon after her arrival, the couple got into an argument and Claire insisted on walking home. She left at around 10 p.m. and began the 4-mile walk towards her home in Northolt, northwest London. John Ive followed her part of the way and tried to persuade Claire to get into his car, but she refused. It was 6:30 the next morning when Detective Superintendent Ken Linney of the Thames Valley Police received the message that a body had been found on the River Thames promenade at Barry Avenue in Windsor by a man named Kevin Deacon who was on his way to work. During the course of that day, Claire's mother reported her missing, but it wasn't until the evening that she heard that a body had been found. The location of the body was a good 12 miles from Claire's home, but her family feared the worst. Those fears were soon realised when police identified Claire's body using photographs given to them by her mother, although other sources say that identification was made through dental records. Claire Woolterton had been stripped of her clothing, strangled and sadistically mutilated. None of her clothing was ever found. When John Ive, the man Claire had been seeing, was arrested on suspicion of her murder, he explained that on the night she had gone missing, he had returned home after she refused his lift. His neighbour who had seen him arrive at home was considered a genuine alibi, so Ive was taken off the suspects list. After Claire's murder received a great deal of press coverage, a woman came forward to say that she had seen a young girl pulled into a dark-coloured car at the junction of Uxbridge Road and Yedding Lane, which was a short distance from Claire's home. But her account was so vague the car was never traced. House-to-house inquiries in the area followed, and past convicted criminals with histories of violent and sexual offences were investigated. After a 7-month-long investigation, the methods at the disposal of the Thames Valley Police in the early 1980s failed to yield any useful leads. One of those methods, known as taping, was used to lift debris from Claire's skin with adhesive tape. The tape was then put into storage in the hope that it would one day hold forensic clues. On the morning of December 23, 1984, the body of 29-year-old Deirdre Sainsbury was found in a wooded area of Denham Golf Course in Buckinghamshire. The similarities between the deaths of Deirdre and Claire were stark. Neither body had been concealed, both of them had been attacked with a sharp implement post-mortem, and in this case one breast was removed. Detective Ken Linney, who headed the 1981 murder investigation, spoke out immediately. It was his belief that the same person was responsible, and the outcome could have been the same if it wasn't for one vigilant person. After seeing a young woman hitchhiking and then get into a car, a man who had recently read an article in the Reader's Digest about the dangers of hitchhiking quickly took down the registration. That registration led police to the home of 37-year-old salesman and amateur hockey enthusiast Colin Campbell. When a quick search of his home uncovered clothing belonging to Deirdre Sainsbury, Campbell admitted to killing her, but his explanation was bizarre to say the least. He said that after he had picked her up from Upper Richmond Road, Roehampton, on the evening of December 22nd, the two of them got on very well. So well in fact that he made a move on Deirdre. When she responded by slapping him in the face, he said he slapped her back, unintentionally knocking her unconscious. Because she now knew his name, he thought she may report him to the police, so he took a hockey stick from his car and beat her across the head with it. He then said that when he was sure she was dead, he mutilated her body, to make it look as if a psychopath had done it. Now charged with the murder of Deirdre Sainsbury, Campbell was questioned about the Woolterton murder. He denied any knowledge of it, and with no further evidence to link him to the crime, nothing more could be done. Campbell stood trial for Sainsbury's murder in July of 1985. For his defence, he claimed that he had suffered an epileptic fit while he was with Sainsbury, and it was the fit that led to him unintentionally killing her. The judge and jury did not accept this explanation, and Campbell was sentenced to 24 years in prison for murder. 11 years later, he appealed his conviction, again claiming that an epileptic fit had caused him to kill. In fact, he had found a professional in the field of medicine who upheld this theory on the grounds that Campbell had, at the time, been on the wrong kind of medication. Therefore, in his opinion, the attack on Deirdre could have been the result of the effects caused by that medication. A retrial was granted. This took place in 1999. In light of the new defence, the murder charge was quashed. However, it was agreed that Campbell was still a danger to the public, so he was to remain behind bars for the lesser conviction of manslaughter. It had been 30 years since the brutal murder of Claire Woolterton. Since then, many cold cases had been reopened and re-examined using modern DNA testing techniques. Beginning in 2007, an operation headed by Peter Byrne of the Thames Valley Police reopened a series of London-based cold cases. In 2011, Claire Woolterton's case got its turn, and it was a 30-year-old adhesive tape that was under the police spotlight. When minute hairs lifted in 1981 were tested for DNA and the results were run through the National DNA Database, one name stood out. It was the now 66-year-old Colin Campbell. When confronted, Campbell said that he did not remember Claire Woolterton, but added that he had been acquainted with numerous women in his younger years, suggesting that his hair could have been passed on to her after an innocent meeting. This was disregarded by the Crown Prosecution Service, and Colin Campbell was charged with the murder of Claire Woolterton. On November 15, 2013, he stood trial at Reading Crown Court. He pleaded not guilty and cited the same defence as he had at the 1999 retrial for the murder of Deirdre Sainsbury, that being on the wrong medication had caused him to act in an uncontrollable violent manner, which led to the death of Miss Woolterton. But the same medical professionals who had upheld his claim in 1999 were now of the opinion that medication could not be blamed for two brutal murders. Colin Campbell was sentenced to a further 24 years behind bars, bringing the 32-year-old case to a close. In the early hours of Friday, January 7, 1928, a police constable on his nightly beat along the Victoria Embankment noticed in the dim streetlight a sudden rush of water surging over the road. Thinking that it must be a broken water main, he went to investigate and found that the river's bank had burst. Watching the water rapidly spill over the street towards the houses opposite and suddenly realising the danger the inhabitants were in, he raised the alarm. As word of the emergency spread and the enormity of the situation dawned, fire engines raced along the increasingly flooded roads, ringing their bells to wake people from their beds. Firemen and other volunteers worked feverishly to pump water out of the homes, while sandbags were piled high in areas still under threat. Spanning 30 miles of river, thousands of homes from Hammersmith to Dartford were affected, along with the Houses of Parliament, the Tower of London and the Blackwall Tunnel. A large section of the parapet of the embankment outside the Tate Gallery was demolished and scattered across the road. Water poured into the gallery, washing the night watchman out of the building. It was even reported that by the early hours of the morning, ships and boats in Dartford were forced to the streets by the river's surge. But rather than dwell on the structural damage, I want to pay particular attention to the human story. When the waters broke into the basement properties of Ranelagh Gardens to the east of Putney Bridge, it wasn't long before the home of Mrs. Watson, her 24-year-old daughter Irene, and 10-year-old son Billy was completely underwater. That night, accompanying the Watsons was Marjorie and Peter Franquise, and a cousin of the family named Mabel. When water began to pour into the house, naturally a mad rush for escape followed, but when Miss Franquise found herself alone in the relative safety of the flooded street, she returned to the house. Smashing a window and cutting her arms and legs in the process, she managed to regain entry. Marjorie Franquise saved all but two of the occupants. Irene Watson and her cousin were drowned. When their bodies were later recovered, it appeared that before her attempt to escape, Irene had put on a large coat over her nightdress, which, once soaked through, would have made it impossible to escape. Two servant girls, 20-year-old Evelyn Hyde and 23-year-old Annie Morton, found themselves trapped at River Court, a large house on the riverbank at Upper Mall, Hammersmith. The owners of the house were away at the time, so the girls' bodies were not found until the butler returned after the waters had receded. 25-year-old Frank Wiltshire entered the basement of his house on the now non-existent Hinchcliffe Street, which was to the southeast of Lambeth Bridge. He managed to help the other occupants escape the flood, but was unable to save himself. The basement door swung shut from the force of the water, trapping him inside. A short distance away, one Mr. Gable attempted to rescue 76-year-old Mrs. Quick from her basement on Corston Street. As the water level rose to his neck, he recalled seeing the elderly woman on her bed, which was now almost touching the ceiling. Mrs. Quick, lying on her bed, was pinned to the ceiling of the basement under the pressure of the water and drowned. Mr. Gable escaped, and so did the daughter of the ill-fated woman, who was miraculously forced out of a window as the water rushed in. As tragic as these events are, probably the saddest incident to come out of the 1928 flood concerns the Harding family at number 8 Grosvenor Road. This story is probably best described through Mr. Harding's own retelling, which featured in many newspapers from that day. I have 8 children altogether. These 4 girls were sleeping in the front basement kitchen. I only moved them down there from a bedroom in the top floor a few days ago because it was warmer. I saw them at 11:30 last night and said to them, "Good night and God bless you." About 2 hours afterwards the river rose. There must have been 4 feet of water against the protecting wall of the embankment, which gave way with a loud noise, and a mass of water came across the road and entered the house practically without warning. It quickly submerged the basement kitchen and rose right above it to the first floor. I thought at once of my girls, but I couldn't get down there. The water by this time was up to the first floor parlour, where my other 4 children were sleeping. I got them out, but there were iron bars in front of the kitchen window, and I could not get the door open owing to the force of the water inside the room. Heroic attempts were made by my neighbours, but the girls were caught and drowned in something under 20 seconds. When we got at them, they seemed to have died without a struggle. It was first reported that as many as 21 people died in the flood of 1928, but the official number was 14. One of those was 72-year-old Jane Hawley of Vincent Street, Westminster, who did not drown, but later died of shock. A final tale of heroism comes from the Westminster Gazette dated Monday, January 9th. It tells a story of Miss Sarah Russell of Hinchcliffe Street, who was the first to alert her neighbours to the incoming flood. Entering one home, she rescued 1-month-old twins. So what caused the Great Flood of 28? Well, during Christmas 1927, heavy snow fell in the Cotswolds in central England where the Thames has its source. A sudden thaw which occurred on New Year's Eve, followed by unusually heavy rain, doubled the volume of water coming down the river. The predicted tide at Swan Pier at 1:30 a.m. on January 7, 1928 was 21 foot, but this rose by an extra 6 foot 1 inch, which led to the breaching of many areas of the embankment from Hammersmith to Dartford. In 1923, family boating company the Salter Brothers built the Marchioness, a 26 metre long and 4.5 metre wide pleasure boat. At the time of the Second World War, the small vessel was requisitioned by the Thames Hospital Service and took part in the rescue of British troops from Dunkirk. In 1978 she was purchased by Tidal Cruise Limited, underwent some refurbishments and continued her life as a pleasure boat on the River Thames. This is the embankment pier at Charing Cross, just west of Waterloo Bridge. It was here on August 20th, 1989, that the Marchioness was moored in preparation for a late-night excursion to Tower Bridge and then Greenwich for the 26th birthday celebration of City banker Antonio de Vasconcelos, a party organised by his close friend Jonathan Pang. At approximately 1 am, a party of 130 people began to board the vessel. At 1:20 am, the Marchioness left her moorings and headed east downstream. At around the same time and 2 miles upstream, an 80-metre long and 14-metre wide dredger named Bobelle began its journey, also heading east, passing under Waterloo Bridge at 1:35 am. By the time the much slower Marchioness had passed under the central arch of Blackfriars Bridge, she was only half a mile in front of the Bobelle. The two vessels' already close proximity continued to close between Blackfriars Bridge and Southwark Bridge, but it was when the Marchioness was about to pass under Southwark Bridge that it began to be affected by the heavy water being pushed ahead of the Bobelle as the dredger overtook another pleasure boat named the Hurlington. At approximately 1:45 am, passengers on board the Marchioness saw the dredger approaching before they were struck 6 metres from the stern. This initial blow turned the Marchioness to port before it was struck again. This second blow caused it to overturn. After the Bobelle's anchor tore off the upper floor of the Marchioness, sheer weight and momentum pushed the lower section underwater. The Marchioness sank within a minute of the first impact. All emergency services in the area were deployed, and 79 of the 130 passengers on board the pleasure boat were rescued. The number of dead pulled from the water that night varied in reports, but the total number, including victims found 8 miles away days later, was 51. Among them was Antonio de Vasconcelos, who had been celebrating his birthday, and the Marchioness's captain, 29-year-old Stephen Faudo. When the Marchioness was raised on the afternoon of August 20th, 24 bodies were found on board. It was immediately decided that there would be no public inquiry, and the Marine Accident Investigation Branch report would determine the cause of the collision. During the initial post-mortem process, it was decided that for the bodies not yet found, visual identification would be unreliable and too traumatic for family members, therefore the hands would be removed in order to take fingerprints. When more bodies were raised in the days to come, 25 pairs of hands were removed. But this information did not emerge until 1992, when it was discovered that the families had not been asked for permission before doing so. It was even reported that one family member had been shown the wrong body, and then later the right one with the hands removed. Those hands were later returned to the family with a letter of apology. When the Marine Accident Investigation Branch report was made, it concluded that the collision was caused by both captains' failure to keep a sufficient lookout on both vessels. The Bobelle, being a dredger, had collected sand and gravel from the riverbed. The sediment, which was piled high at the front of the boat, severely impeded visibility at the bow, leaving a blind spot of around 400 metres and making it impossible for the crew to see the Marchioness. Indeed, it came to light that the captain of the Bobelle, Douglas Henderson, wasn't immediately aware that the collision had taken place and did not assist in the rescue. On the part of the Marchioness, it was said that the captain Stephen Faudo would not have been able to hear the radio warnings over the loud music playing on board, making him equally unaware. However, the families of the victims criticised the report for not including testimonies from the survivors. The reason for this was never made clear, but because many of them had been drinking that evening, their recollections may have been deemed unreliable. In the days following the disaster, there were conflicting estimates of the number of people on board, and some tabloids were unsympathetic to the victims in their reporting, suggesting that the party members were all very rich young people drinking and taking drugs. The inquest into the victims' deaths, which were opened and adjourned on the day after the accident, did not proceed until April 23, 1990. But this was amidst calls for Captain Douglas Henderson of the Bobelle to face prosecution. After only 3 days, the inquest was halted again, when it was decided by Director of Public Prosecution Alan Green that Henderson should face charges under the Merchant Shipping Act of 1988. But in 1991, Henderson was acquitted of any wrongdoing after 2 juries failed to reach a verdict. Again, failure to include important witness statements in the proceedings was blamed by the families for the unsatisfactory outcome. The inquest into the cause of the accident resumed 4 years later, taking place in March and April of 1995. At this stage, Douglas Henderson's professionalism was called into question when it was proved that he had been drinking on the day of the disaster. However, it was deemed that any alcohol would have left his system by the time of the collision. In summing up, new coroner John Burton instructed the jury that a verdict of unlawful killing could not be applied to anyone who had already been cleared by a court. To Burton's frustration, the jury returned a verdict of unlawful killing regardless, but as no one could be named as personally responsible, the verdict did not carry a punishment. Following the 1997 election, which saw the Labour Party brought into power, a petition was sent to John Prescott, Secretary of State for Transport and Deputy Prime Minister, asking for another inquest. He agreed, but the outcome was much the same. The cause of the collision was due to poor lookout on both vessels. As no single person could be blamed for the accident, it was advised that a charge of manslaughter, which was the outcome the victims' families had hoped for, was likely to fail. Compensation was eventually awarded to many of the victims' families, but after funeral and legal costs, most were left with very little. One family, who were reported to have been awarded £45,000, was left with £312 after these costs were met. In September of 1989, a memorial stone inscribed with the names of the victims was unveiled at Southwark Cathedral, 120 metres from the site of the disaster. The Bow Bell was sold in 1992 to a maritime company in St Vincent and the Grenadines, then to a Portuguese company in 1996. That same year, the Bow Bell sank off the coast of Madeira, taking one crew member with her.